afternoon and welcome to our Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex and today we'll be discussing ES document workflow. One of the things we've noticed, especially as new people come in and try and get up to speed on ES, we have a lot of webinars on advanced features where we spend an hour or whatever deep diving into some more advanced or obscure topic, but we didn't really have a good one-on-one primer to show people the basics of ES workflow. So this is really intended as a getting started guide. So maybe you've been using ES for a while, but you've only been using the prepackaged workflows. Maybe you inherited a system from someone else and you're trying to learn how to maintain those workflows. Or maybe you're just totally new to ES altogether and looking for some steps on getting started. This is going to be sort of a deep dive into the basics. So today we're going to go through building simple workflows, configuring projects or folders, for example, to use those workflows, configuring some of the basic things you would put into workflows like approvals, deliveries, milestones for status for users. Then we'll go over some common pitfalls and some troubleshooting techniques that might help. As far as timing goes at the end, if we have a little more time after that, I think most of that should cover the hour. If you don't have a hard stop at 2 Central, then I'm going to show a few more examples of some conditional context-specific workflows after that towards the end. So hopefully you can stay on for that. Now, the one thing is I probably did overpromise a little on the mailer we sent out. I was originally planning to dive a lot more into metadata and working with Twist in conjunction with ES in here. But unfortunately, for time reasons, my initial test run-throughs of this webinar were taking almost 2 hours. So I had to do a lot of cutting just to get this down to a reasonable time. So if you join for those specific topics of metadata or Twist, I apologize. We're not really going to have time to deep dive into those today. If you're interested in other of those topics, we do have some more webinars focusing specifically on both Twist and metadata. I think when we get to post this on YouTube, maybe I'll dig up a list of other related webinars, both those and some other more advanced workflow webinars, and put some links out there so you've got some more resources to follow up on what we discussed today. As far as a few notes about scope here, webinar is a very, or not webinar, workflow is a very sprawling and complex topic. So I really want to keep this focused on essential components. So the things you need to know to get started building workflows. So I think the first 40 or so minutes is going to be focused on building a few really basic, simple approval workflows and really deep diving into all the things you need to configure to set that up. One of the challenges of this is ES has a lot of interconnected dependencies. So there's a lot of other things you have to touch on, like metadata and output channels that you need to use in order to configure certain workflow actions. But there's no way for time today that we could really deep dive into those. So all the workflow essential stuff I'm going to really deep dive into. A few of those other dependencies like metadata and output channels, I'll try and show you the most key parts of those, but we can't really deep dive into those as well. And as mentioned, after we finish the webinar and go through questions and everything at the very end, if you want to stick on a little past the hour, then I'll show a few more, slightly more advanced examples to try and give you some ideas of what ES workflow is capable of and what the next steps based on what we've shown today are. So I guess maybe the first place to get started with workflow is to just show it to you. So I've got ES up here. Ignore the second window. It's going to be for later when I'm jumping around between settings and different areas. I don't want to keep moving the screen on you. So, but what I'll do here is I have a simple project. I'll upload a few pages here and push them into my ES. And generally when you upload files to ES, they're going to be run through a workflow. That does sort of things like you'll see here with these files as they come in. They'll be uploaded. The ES will generate a thumbnail preview of them. In this case, I've defined my workflow to pause for an approval step so I can, for example, look at these things in dialogue, look at them to see if I like the content or whatever and make notes on them. And then from there, I can either approve them, which means they move forward in the workflow, or reject them, which means in this case, maybe they get sent to maybe like a printer's FTP server or something. In this case, based in special folders based on the customer name and code and project. So I can also do more advanced workflows because you're not just married to one particular design like this. You're not given whatever what Dalim gives you and you're stuck with that. You can build workflows to match your process. So this is a fairly simple setup. Files come in, preview, approval, and delivery. You can also do more complex workflows as well. So I'll push into files real quick and let this start crunching. So I'll push these in. And ES workflow, if you're coming to this from a Twist background, there's some differences between ES and Twist workflow, and the main one is just overall goals. Twist is in general focused on low-level file normalization. So if you push files into Twist, you're focused on pre-flooding them for potential print errors, looking for example, maybe doing color conversion trapping, just low-level optimizations. ES is more focused on business process, so making sure that when you're creating content, you have a central source of truth where you can keep material that's being worked on, the ability to review files, revise files, approve or reject them, and let people weigh in and make their notes and files as they're being produced and eventually maybe delivered to a printer or some other location. So they're basically for shepherding files through a production or creation process. So Twist tends to be focused a little more on that rather than the low-level file normalization. And of course, I uploaded the wrong file here, but basically what this second workflow is going to do is, this is an example of a slightly more complex workflow. In this case, files are going to come in. I actually did integrate this particular workflow with Twist. So files come in, they get pre-flighted. If it finds any pre-flight errors, it actually brings in a pre-flight report that I can view to see, for example, what issues there might be with this file. So highlights here, for example, there's some issues with low resolution images and white overprint and just different bad things. And I can choose whether I want to approve or reject that file, or even maybe have that automatically rejected if something really bad like white overprint is in there. After I go through that approval cycle, I can also have multiple approvals, not just the one like we had in the last example. So in this case, I can have a design approval and a secondary pre-press approval. If you really want to get fancy, like the examples I'll be showing at the end, you can even do conditional things where different files go through different cases, or maybe a file that's intended for web based on some metadata only goes through the design approval and skips the pre-press approval, whereas other files that are intended for print go through both approvals in this process. Now, the one just other example of sort of things you can do with workflow here is you can also have workflows that users can run on demand. So for example, I can come in here and run this, what we call a user action, and basically make a copy of this file that's going to be sent to Twist, and it's going to generate a watermarked copy for me to download. And actually in this case, I think it's going to download it right away and show that I did some low-level modifications here and actually change the file. So that's, for example, doing something on demand like cropping or modifying a file. And that could be either the file that's in ES or a secondary copy like we did here that's non-destructive editing of the original. So just different examples of the different ways you can use workflow. It's a very powerful tool for managing approvals and managing files. So we've talked a little bit about how you can use these workflows and the sort of things they do. How do we build these workflows? Generally, if you're building these workflows, one of the things you're going to do is go ahead and click the admin tab here, and go to workflows, workflow creation, and if you bring down that tree, there's a document workflow area. And if I go in here and I click new, well, first off, it'll show me all the workflows I have, but if I click new, it'll give me a example here that I can use to give it a name or whatever. As far as other settings in here, there are different types of workflow which we're not going to focus today, including project workflow, which is useful for dealing with large groups of files if you need to coordinate things that involve multiple files in one workflow. There are also, for example, form workflows, which are used if you're doing imposition in ES for a press. The only setting in here, I think, for just getting started that's worth noting is priority. So this allows you to tell ES how important you think files going through this workflow are in general. Maybe you've got a workflow where you're ingesting some old legacy assets into a DAM and just making like a simple preview. That might not be super important. You might be fine if those take a few days to crunch. However, you may have some press print files that are going to have to go to press, and those would be higher priority, and you want those to go through as soon as possible. In general, if your system's very loaded down and is kind of slammed with work, ES will use this as a guideline to know what it needs to process first. And you can always tweak this for individual files if you need to later, but sometimes it's helpful to say, okay, I know this process is more important. This should probably run first. But I've gone ahead, I've named my workflow, I've chosen a few basic settings. So I'll go ahead and create this workflow here, and we have a canvas that we can drag and drop tools into. That's generally the idea of workflow here, is I can take tools and I can drag and drop different tools into this workflow and link them together, and ES will follow through each of these tools and perform whatever function this tool does at that point in the process. Now, there's a few different ways you can get tools into the workflow. The first way is the one I just used down here, where I dragged and dropped the tool from this palette into the viewer. This palette's pretty nice. It's actually organized by the function, because different tools perform different types of tasks. And Dalim tried to group them in ways that are pretty logical. So there are approval-related tools, I/O tools for input and output, imposition tools. Everything's generally organized around the function it performs here, so it's a little easier to find them. If you want to drill down even further, you can actually search for the name of a specific tool, and it'll narrow down the results there, so it's easy to get to the one you want to see. Now, a second way of adding tools in here is by right-clicking on the workflow canvas and clicking New Step, and then you can go through the categories. It's the same categories you see here, and you can drill down that way and find your tool directly without having to mouse over to the other side of the screen. So both can be useful here. As far as another thing with the editor too, by default, you'll notice I have this grid enabled. I think that tends to be enabled by default in ES. If you go into the tools area, you can actually hide that grid too, so that you can just freeform place things wherever you want. I tend to like the grid these days. Some people like it, some don't. I tend to like it because it's a little easier for actually bringing in tools. You don't have to worry, because they'll automatically snap to that grid, and it's a little easier. I don't have to worry about manually lining them up. But we'll go ahead, we'll add in a few more tools in our basic workflow. So I guess we'll put in next an approval step, and then we'll put lastly a digital delivery step, and we'll link all those together. So here we go. So we've got our basic workflow here. And what this is doing, the first step here is this input files. And generally anything that for most workflows, you're gonna want input files to be your first step. It's needed anytime this is the first workflow file hits when it's uploaded to the system. Input files tells ES that, okay, there's a new file being ingested, bring it in and run it through the workflow. The next step in here we have is preview generation. And that's in charge of generating, if we go into one of our projects, that's in charge of generating both the thumbnails and the low-res previews you see if you hit the space bar in there. So that's in charge of that. It also, as a side note, does metadata extraction. So it's used to do, if you're doing a more extensive metadata extraction so that you can have that information ingested into ES for search. It also does as a side effect, because it is opening the file and reading it. Then we have an approval step in here, unless we were delivering maybe to a printer or something. So this is pretty simple. This is actually not too far off from the default workflow that Dalim ships with ES, which is WFL Dialog. Same kind of setup, similar to what a lot of people are doing. Now, for some of these tools, if you click on them, in the right-hand pane, you'll see a contextual menu that will show you more information on just different options that might be available to you in this tool. And different tools will have different settings that you can optionally turn on, or some settings that you might mandatorily have to enable for the tool to function correctly. So for our current workflow, going through just a few of the interesting ones, one of the first here is in preview generation. There is a option here called draft. And what that does is, let's say you have a multi-page PDF. Say you've got a 500-page PDF. In general, when you upload that file and it hits preview generation in your workflow, ES is going to generate thumbnails and previews for all 500 of those pages. The reason why that can be useful is, I actually have a job here that normal document thing in here. This is a multi-page PDF, and you'll see pretty quickly, I'm on a tiny VM, but you'll see I get thumbnails pretty quickly. If I zoom between pages, I get a low-res preview mode for a lot of these pretty quickly, if my VM would behave. So I get a pretty quick preview, because generally if, ES is waiting, Dialog's waiting to do the high-res rendering of the file for your screen, it'll show you that low-res preview as a placeholder. So if I click around, it's pretty quick to show me things in here. But the downside, and it's handy for that because I see all those previews very quickly in Dialog, but if I have a 500-page book, it's got to run through all 500 pages, and that can take a lot of processing time. Other files can get backlogged behind that. So what the draft option here does is it only generates a preview for the first page. So in that case, it'll run through and only generate a first preview for that first page. So the downside to the convenience for that is that means it's much quicker to go through the step. On my system, my 30-page book took about like 40 or 50 seconds on my tiny VM with 30 pages, and my draft mode one took about 10 seconds. but it does mean you'll sometimes have to wait a little longer when you open dialog for those thumbnails to show up, and a little longer for actual page high-res to render. That low-res preview won't be available more or less immediately to show you what the page looks like until the high-res is finished rendering in dialog, which can take a little bit sometimes. So trade-offs there. And if that's a case where you've got maybe a catalog that's got 500 pages that are all unique, you might want that to run all the pages. If you have like a variable data mailer and all the pages in your PDF are the same, you might only want to see the first just to make sure the general content looks okay. And that's the case where it might be fine to just hit the draft button in there. For the approval step we have here, generally with approvals, you don't configure them in the workflow itself. You might be using the same workflow for multiple customers, so it wouldn't necessarily make sense to configure all of those approval details hard-coded into the workflow. So not too much we want to tweak in there right now. Now for the delivery, when we want to send to maybe a printer or something, we do that by pointing the workflow to an output channel. And this is, I think, one of the things that tends to get a little confusing for people who are newer to ES. This is where ES has a lot of just different modular settings that are configured in other areas outside of the workflow. And it has its uses, but it can be a little confusing to learn it first. So I'll go over to my other window here. And if I go into my output channels here, I have an output channel to NFS here, and we're going to send files to that output channel. And that basically defines this, for example, this path here that we're delivering files to. Made that a little too big. So that defines what path files are going to. I can determine whether or not that's just a local transmit to a folder or a mount on my ES server. I can go to an FTP or SFTP, or even in some cases, cloud storage. But this defines some delivery point that I want to send to. The one thing I think that gets confusing for people with that is, like I said, it's you might be thinking it would be handier if you could just actually type the delivery details directly in the workflow. So set up the FTP details, the folder stuff directly in the workflow. And that's how Twist tended to work by default. So if you had a Twist workflow, you might put all the FTP credentials directly in your delivery tool. But the problem there is, let's say you have 15 workflows that deliver to that printer. The problem then is the printer changes their FTP password, or they decide they want you to send to a different folder hierarchy. Then the problem with that is you can run into is then you have to go into 15 workflows and manually make that tweak. This way, there's a little more redundancy in that you just point to an output channel, and if you have 15 workflows that are sending to that printer, they all use the same output channel. So if the printer changes the password or changes the path, then you only have to go and update in that one place, and all the workflows will pick that up automatically. So definitely makes things a little easier in the long run, even if there's a little bit more of a learning curve, because you have to remember where these things are set up outside of the actual workflow itself. The one other thing I'll mention, just as an interesting side note here, is because I use some variables in my path here for customer code and job name, both for these kind of output channels and for the workflow config itself. One thing that's very useful is the on-screen help in ES. So if you're on a screen like the output channel config and you go to the help menu up here, and select screen help, it'll bring up a mini little help document on this page. And that will have some more details on, for example, how to create an output channel, how to configure different things. And that actually has, for example, a listing of the sort of variables I can use in one of these channels and what sort of information they give me. One of the reasons I bring this up is because of actually a bug report we put in recently. We had an issue where a customer was trying to pull some information from here and copy and paste that into one of the output channels. And one of the problems we ran into is this little help guide is formatted as HTML, and there was some weird HTML control character embedded inside, a hidden character embedded inside this actual text. So when they copy pasted from this documentation to the path in here, it wasn't working. So we do have a bug report in. Dalim is working on fixing that, but if you do use this guide for now, it's probably safer to just type the thing in manually rather than copy pasting. So just a friendly heads up there. That is contextual, so if you bring that up on the workflow screen, that'll also give you some details on just different things you can do in workflow, different tools that are available, how you use different features related to workflow, which can make it helpful to manage some of these dependencies if you're trying to hunt and find, okay, what's an output channel? Where do I find that? That on-screen help can be very useful for things like that. Now, there's a few more things we can do this workflow before we give it over to the end user just for quality of life. And one of those is by adding something that we call milestones. If I go over here, because when we were looking at this, generally in ES, if you look at just make my screen tinier again. So if you generally look at the files in ES and you don't have any milestones configured, users get some pretty scant information, so they can see generally roughly what percentage of file is into the workflow, as well as whether it's good or bad or what's going on with it. But they don't have a lot of, they might want to know more about exactly what are the steps in the process, where am I at? And there's a category of informational tools called milestones that help you give more information to the end users. Now, when I say informational tools, all the tools we have in here are functional or process-based. They're performing some specific function. They're in the workflow to perform some task. So preview generations in the workflow, it's performing the task of making thumbnails. Digital deliveries in the workflow because it's actually delivering files to a path or an FTP or something somewhere. Milestones are more informational. In most cases, they don't do anything, but they tell the user where the file is at. So if I go over here to like one of these files in this workflow, and I go to this little document status tab, I can see all these little things that tell me where I am in the process and just general points of my process. So material received, approval, approved, delivered. And you can drag those milestones into certain points of the workflow and link them up, and those will tell the end user where they're at in the process. Now, the thing with these milestones is, I lost my train of thought there, but I guess we'll link these in and then hopefully it'll come back. So we can push these milestones in. So I'm gonna go ahead and actually just, oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. ES does ship a few of these milestones by default. So there are some standard ones like the ones I have in this workflow that basically they ship with ES, you can use them no matter what. If you have the enterprise project tracking license option, you can also build your own custom milestones that are a little more specific, which I used a few of those in my advanced workflow. So I made a few of my own ones for, like, for example, pre-press waiting for approval, design waiting for approval, just because I wanted to give more unique names for different breakpoints in the workflow. If you're doing enterprise project tracking, you can also use these in some cases for a very special type of milestone approval. And you can also configure them to act as deadlines in some cases. So if you don't pass a milestone by a certain time, someone gets a nasty email letting them know they breached deadline, for example. But I guess we'll go push a few of these into our workflow here. So I'll put in material received. And I'm just going to stage these down here and we can link them up in a minute. So I'll do waiting for approval. Too many milestones named waiting for approval. Then I'll do approved and maybe delivered at the end. And so as far as linking new tools into an existing workflow like this, I can always just delete the link and manually relink and make new links in there. One thing I can do to reduce clicks on something like that is if I right-click the link, I can click relink here. And what that'll do is that'll put two little handles over either side of the link. And I can click and drag one of those to reuse the link, which I think here saves me a click or two. So that I don't have to delete and then recreate. I can just reuse one of the links at least and move everything together. One of the things that can be useful too is if I, for example, let's say I'm clicking and dragging in the wrong direction and I accidentally link this tool up backwards, that's not going to work correctly because the tool's not going in the right order. If I want to correct that, I don't have to delete the link. I can right-click it and click invert, and it'll change the direction that that link follows. Now, if I want to clean this up a little more too, I can also select multiple tools, and as I hit Shift and I click and drag, and I can select multiple tools and move them over. So that way I don't have to move every single tool one by one to make room for my milestones in my little flowchart. So yeah, stick this up here, and we've got our general process here. Now, two important notes on milestones before we go any further. The first is, because this order is kind of important over here, we're trying to give people an idea of the actual process overall, and it makes sense for those to be chronological. Generally, the way milestones work in ES is they display in the order you added them into the workflow, which if you're adding them and you're building the workflow in a sort of linear fashion, then that tends to work okay because I add the first one first and the second one second. But a lot of workflows don't work that way because you may be modifying these workflows and changing them over time. And one of the problems we sometimes run into is that you run into a case where maybe if I put the delivered milestone in first, that would show first in this list, which might not be what I would want here. So what I can do in that case is I can hard set the order that they display in for end users by selecting the milestone and entering a number for the milestone order in this right-hand contextual pane. So I can set the first one to 1, second one to 2. Watch out later in the webinar because I'm probably going to forget to do this when we add some new milestones in your workflow. And that'll be a good example of what not to do. But I went ahead and added those in. The second common gotcha I'll let you know for milestones to watch out for is a few of the default milestones that Dalim ships with ES have sort of confusing or misleading names. So if I go in here, for example, and search for preview generation, one of the things that's funny in here is there's the actual preview generation tool, which does thumbnails, which we need to generate the thumbnails. But there's also a milestone in here called preview generation. And I think Dalim's intent for this was that you could put this in before the preview generation. So the end user will get a little thing here that tells them, so if maybe the system's backlogged, they can see, okay, this file's waiting to get to the actual preview generation step. But it does tend to be a little confusing because it has the same exact name as the actual preview generation tool. So I've had cases where I'm in a hurry and I mistakenly drag in the milestone instead of the actual tool that does the preview generation, which can be confusing because then if you do this, this is only an informational tool that lets you know you're at a certain part of the workflow. This one doesn't actually do any preview generation, whereas this one down here does. There's a few other milestones like check pre-flight for twist pre-flighting stuff where Dalim does the same thing. And just a heads up to watch for because I know that one's bitten me. So as far as just a few more quality of life things really quickly before we move on to showing the workflow, I'm actually going to get really quickly and make a little more room in here for one of the examples I'm going to show because I need a little more space here. So few of the things you can do to make these a little easier to maintain or understand, especially as they get more complex. First off, you can rename any of these tools. So I can name this like Cool People Approval or whatever. And I can even rename Send to Printer because in a complex workflow, you might even have multiple deliveries to different places. And it's helpful to know what this delivery is intended for so you can give it a more user-friendly name. You can also add details in here. I think we're actually going to see I can hit a note and I can type a note. So you can put some nice documentation in here. So if you're looking at this workflow 2 or 3 years down the road, you remember what it's doing and you have some built-in documentation here to make things a little easier. The third feature in here that is a quality of life thing is, this one's seen a little bit of mixed adoption, but I think it's worth showing, is if you go under Tools and you go to the Group Creation Mode option, you can also hit the Q button on your keyboard to bring this up automatically as well. But if I go in here and I drag around a number of tools, I can create a workflow group. And I can choose a color or whatever, and basically it says all these tools are linked, and I can give it a nickname like my approval cycle. And you can even add notes on these. So if you want to document a whole section of the workflow. The reasons this can be handy is because all these tools are color-coded, especially when you get into more complex workflows, like one of the ones I have here, if I can find it. It can be very helpful to know if you've got like multiple simultaneously approval things going on, generally what the key segments of your workflow are and have them color-coded. So they're a little more visually distinguishable. It's also useful because if you need to drag these tools, you can move them around pretty easily. And if your workflow is getting very complex or visually cluttered, you can click the minus button to collapse that whole approval cycle and simplify the view of the workflow that you see in here a little more. Kind of a useful feature. It has seen, I think, mixed adoption overall because it tends to behave a little clunky in some behaviors. I'm actually going to save it before I break this, but like a good example is if I go to resize this workflow and I accidentally drag it a little too far, it'll swallow other tools. And the problem is then I can't shrink that down. They're stuck in there. And I can't manually click and select multiple tools within this this group, so then I'd have to manually drag all the tools out and resize this down again, which does tend to make them slightly clunky to deal with, but still can be worth it, especially if you're trying to document larger workflows. So just a feature to make you aware of. So we've got a slightly more complex workflow set up. We've got a workflow set up. How do we use this workflow? There's a few different ways we can use this workflow in ES. Actually, let me triple check I set my output channel. So the simplest way to use these workflows is to set it at the time you're within a particular project. So I went into this customer, I made a new project, and give it a name. And if I go to the document workflow tab here, I can choose a particular workflow. If I got a large list, I can simplify it a bit. And any files that come into this project will use this workflow. For our approval step we had there, you're configuring the approvals here at the project level. So I can put in whoever I want to approve this step. And if I go ahead and start uploading pages to this project, then those will go through and those will use our workflow. So you'll see they come in and run through the workflow here and do their thing. We should get our approval in a second. Yep, so we got our approval, and I can do my approvals or rejections. We can see all our milestones show up here in the order that we configured. So you can see basically what went on and where you are in the process and get a little more information about status. That's actually nice too, is you can build customized like document status smart views so people can see, for example, everything that's waiting for their approval and where it is and whatever process it's in, and get like a nice bird's eye view of where things are at. But what I'm going to do here is actually one other useful feature too before we get back to the main task is if you're trying to see what's going on with these workflows, you can hit workflow, document workflow, show workflow. There's also a simple, of course it's not going to behave for me, I'm going to do it again. There's also a keyboard shortcut W you can use to bring it up. But this will actually show you the workflow this exact file is running through. You can see exactly what time it went through each step. If there's any errors they'd show in here, especially if you're trying to build or troubleshoot a workflow, it can be very useful to watch this. And you can even do your approvals in here and step through things and watch what happens to files in real time as you're running them through the workflow. If you run into a case where there's some odd one-off error for a particular file, you can also edit the workflow for this file and this file alone to correct the one-off, to spot correct a one-off error in your logic. So that can be a very useful tool for admins, but not something end users would see. One other useful thing I'll mention in here too when we're looking at the workflow is these milestones can be useful because let's say you didn't mean to approve one of these files. You can always do a right-click reprocess if you're an admin or you give users permission to do that. But especially when you get into more advanced workflows, those milestones we set up in here will allow you to reprocess from a specific step. So maybe a user made a mistake, they didn't mean to approve a page, they can do a right-click restart from selection on any of those milestones if you give them permission to do so to back the workflow up to a certain point. So that can be a very useful tool in there for allowing users to work with this. So assigning workflows, back to the main task here, was we can do it in the project level. You can actually assign workflows for specific folders within a project. So maybe you've got some kind of a magazine case and you've got ad pages and you've got editorial pages, and they each have their own folder, and you want the ad and the edit pages to maybe run through a different workflow. By default, these folders that we created, if we go into the settings and template properties, you'll see they have this inherit from parent option selected. That means these files will inherit whatever workflow is set at the project level. If we want to customize it a little further, we can click custom properties and go in here and set different workflows. So we can set, for example, maybe the custom ad workflow, and it'll show us all our different approvers here for the ad workflow, and do the same with an edit workflow for the edit folder. The other thing we can do in here actually though is, would help if I could type, but if we go in here and we choose, for example, the standard workflow, maybe these are each just one approval step, but we have different people who need to approve. Maybe these aren't different enough that we need two separate workflows. We can also use the same workflow, but in these folders set up different approvers. So that maybe for the ad folder, we have the ad group is in charge of approving. And for the edit folder, the edit group is in charge of approving, but they use the same workflow. So that way you're kind of reusing code. You don't have to build two separate workflows, but anything uploaded to any of these two, either of these two folders would have different actors. So now there's one third way that you actually all But this is kind of tedious because we're setting this manually. You don't want to have to go through every single project and set new approvers for every project you make. So one of the things you can do there is you can create what is called a project template. So if I go over here to the administration area in ES, and I go over to users and profiles, just the basic setup, there's a project template area here where you can create what's called a project template. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new template. We'll call it Webinar Live Template. And if you look at a project in ES, generally this has the tabs for different things you can set up, like whatever color settings are used for proofing, what document workflow you're using, what approvers. And the project template's basically the same. You can basically configure defaults for different workflows and whatever workflows and settings are used when a new project is created. And then you can map those to different customers. So maybe I'll choose our Webinar Doc Live, and I'll set up our approver. If you really wanted to go in and do like some of the tweaks we were doing in here earlier with the folders, you can configure the folders in here as well so that when you create the project, it automatically creates both those add and edit folders and configures them so that they run the files through the workflows that you had configured for each of those specific cases with the unique add and edit approvers. So if I want to use these project templates, then what I can do is go into the customer area, select my customer. I think I actually ran into a bug on my system because this was showing up by default. I don't think it should do that, but you can generally would click the link button here and you could link the new template you created to your customer. Now, customers can have multiple templates linked to them and they have a default on top of that that gets chosen. So in here, I have my templates and I can go ahead and choose Webinar Live Template as our default for our customer here. What that means is if I go to create a new project, then what will happen is you'll see it's using that template we have, and it copied all the settings we had configured in our template, including the workflow and any approvers we had in these steps, which saves us a lot of manual setup in here, so that way it's just done whenever you need it. But like I said, you can have multiple templates attached to a customer. So that way, let's say you have a case where a customer does 90% of the work's print, maybe 10% is web, and their print and their web lines use different workflows. In that case, I would link up both their print and their web templates to the project to their customer. Then when you go to create, but I would make the print template the default. That way, when you go to create a new job, you get your standard print settings. But if they have one of their rare web jobs, then a user can go in and when creating the job in the project template area here, choose a different project template and say, I really want to run this through the web template and have it pull all the different settings for the web job. So that way, for the 90% of the jobs, they just create the new job and it picks the correct template. For the web jobs, then they just go in and they select the unique template they need. And it's one manual step, but it means at least they don't have to go in and set up all these approvals by hand. Now there's one third way you can assign these workflows, which I don't think we're going to focus on today, but I'll at least show it so you know it's there. There's also a case in ES when you upload files, they go through an input channel. So if I go into, for example, my rule set here, we really don't have time to dive into the specifics of this, but files are generally matched to input rules based on where they're uploaded or naming convention. There might be cases where you want certain files that match a specific naming convention to go through a specific workflow. In that case, I have an input rule that matches files that have this certain naming convention for my add files. And I know if it matches that naming convention, I know it's an add, and I know I want to run it through a unique workflow. There's an option in here where you can set work files that match this rule to override whatever's set in the project or whatever's set in the folder and use whatever workflow this says here as a special case. That does tend to be a little complex, so there are use cases for it, but it's something generally used sparingly, but just wanted to let you know it was there. But we've generally covered, I think, the main ways you would assign these workflows then. So maybe the next step here is to dive deeper into approvals, since they're such a key part of ES workflow.
Before you jump into, we have a question. I'm not sure if you are too familiar with Switch, but is there an option for save states similar to what's in Switch?
I'm wondering if that's related to my brain's not working now. They changed the save working slot, maybe, is my thought.
Oh,
There's
that's
an
possible.
option.
Didn't
That's
think
what
of,
I'm thinking. I can explain that real quick. That gets a little out of scope for today's webinar. That would be if you're doing something, I'm going to probably go on a slight tangent here, but if you're doing something where you're actually changing a file in Twist, you can do what's called a save working slot or a restore working slot to save a specific snapshot of a file before you do something like we did here with Twist, where we slapped a watermark on the file. There's ways you can basically preserve copies of a file before Twist touched it, and then call those up again at other points in the workflow. That's probably a little out of scope today. Most of the things we're focusing on approval, we're not actually modifying or touching files in any particular case here. So
that may answer the question though. So, something we could show at another time.
yeah, I think we covered that in a few of the Twist workflows we do. So
Yeah.
I can look later and see if we have anything.
Yeah,
But I know we
ask
did a
the
workflow.
question, just let us know if that answers it or if you're looking for something different.
Yep.
And then we might as well cover the other one since you kind of broke off in a different section. Have you experienced an issue where WFL groups tend to duplicate the colored box every time you make an edit?
I think I know someone who reported that issue. I can't see if that's the person. That panel won't expand for me. Give me one sec here. I was wondering if that was, I know someone put in a ticket on that. I don't think we were able to reproduce that, but we did have one report of it.
Okay. Yeah, just get back with us and we can go over that with the ticket.
Yeah.
And that is what was meant with the switch reference. So that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't see the name of the asker to see if the person who asked that's the person who reported the previous ticket or not. But
somebody else responded that they've seen that issue.
Okay, so it's
we'll look into that.
So it sounds like we do have multiple people, but we have heard a report of that. We haven't been able to reproduce that particular issue though, because I think that did get sent to Dalim at one point. But yeah, those features, the group that's talking about those color-coded groups, we were, just to bring everyone else into line on this, that's talking about those color-coded groups here. It sounds like someone was having a bug with those duplicating and making multiple colored shapes here when it shouldn't. But we'll deal with that off of webinar and see what we can do there. So jumping back to the main thread here, we've covered the basics of building workflow. We've gone a little more into how you can set projects to use that workflow. So I guess the next step here is diving a little more into approval because it's such an important part of our process. So one of the things here is, first off, because I think our demo here, we had one of these setups that we had one simple approver in here, for example, but not all of your jobs are going to have just one approver. So I wanted to review a few more of the options you can have in here for how you can configure these approval steps. So the first one here is what types of actors can you place in an approval here? So there's 3 different types of actors that can be placed in approval. The first is actual named users. So you can put particular named users in here. So I can have both, for example, Joan and Nora here as approvers. Generally, if you have multiple approvers in this step, then all of those approvers need to approve the files. So in this case, both Joan and Nora would need to approve the file before it moves on. If either Joan or Nora reject the file, it would be immediately rejected. So there's actual named users. You can also do groups. So I have, for example, a QA group. Let me jump over to my admin area here. And I have a QA group. And maybe I want people from this group to do the approval. So this would say I want someone from the QA group to handle the approval. By default, that has an option here for number of approvers. And by default, when you add a group as an approver, that's set to 1. So it's saying you want 1 person from the QA group to approve. You can set that to more if you say, okay, I want 2 or 3 people from the QA group to approve. You can tweak that to be a little more specific there. But by default, that goes to 1. In cases like this, again, this would be, since we have 2 approvers in here, both of them need to approve. So in this case, we would need the specific named user Nora to approve, as well as 1 person from the QA group, and we don't care who. A third way you can do this is you can use what we call an approval role. So maybe you've got a case where, for example, every job has a CSR, and the CSR needs to approve that particular step. But the CSR is different on every job. What you can do under the administration area is do what we call a user role. So I can create a role called CSR, and it just says this is someone who performs a certain function in a project. I can assign that CSR as an approver, and then I can, as I hit a display glitch, this is the perils of beta testing when you're doing a webinar, but I can go in and I can assign someone to be the CSR for the job, and then the CSR gets access to all those approvals. I think one of the intents for this is a case where maybe you have multiple approvals where the CSR needs to weigh in. It might be more convenient to do it that way than to go in and change the group or the approver for each of those multiple approval steps. But those are the three ways you can assign approvers. Now, one of the interesting things with this is if I upload new pages, so let me push in maybe another page, it will pick up those approvers immediately. Now, if we look at the new page that came in, it'll see whatever the new changes we just made are. But curious, if we look at an existing page in the system, you'll see that this doesn't have the new approvers. It reflects whoever was the approver before I made the change. And this is intentional. And the reason I think Dalim did this is, let's say you have a very complex workflow, a lot of people assign in the approval, maybe multiple approval steps, and you make some drastic changes to the approvers. If a file is halfway through the workflow, Dalim wouldn't want that to suddenly change who's assigned and basically make a bunch of drastic changes to something that's already in motion. So the way these approvals work is they're generally sticky. When a file comes in, it copies whatever settings are configured here for what workflow the file is running through and what people are assigned approvals, and copies those to the file level. Then if you change the approver at the job level later, the files don't update. They retain whatever the approvers were at the time that you uploaded the file. And in general, like I said, I think this makes sense because you don't want to maybe risk tweaking and breaking a file that's in motion and halfway through its review cycle. So if you run into a case like this, what can you do? So probably the more difficult case is if you have a specific named user like Nora here and you want to change that. The only real option in that case is to right click and go to properties and actually change whoever the approver is for this particular file and manually modify it. And you can actually tweak that as a one-off too if you need to, but a way to just kind of emergency tweak the approval to match whatever you needed to. If you're using role or group-based approvals, you do have a little more flexibility. If you have a group approval, you can change it. Again, these are sticky, so these will stay stuck to the QA group or the CSR role unless you do the right-click properties. But if you don't want to do that, you can change whoever's the members of the QA group. So you can add or remove people from that QA group, and it will immediately change who has the ability to approve this file. Likewise, if you had like the CSR role in here like we did before, you could go to the job ticket, change who's assigned as a CSR, and have that immediately take effect so that that changes who has the ability to approve that page without having to go in and manually edit it. So that can be a useful tweak in there. So, but those are your three main types of approvers: individual named users, members of a group, or someone who performs a specific function like being a CSR within a certain project. Now for these approval steps, there are also three different types of functions that these actors can perform within the approval. So there are what are called approvers, there are what are called reviewers, and there are also what are called gatekeepers. So the approvers are the standard setting. Let me go to my two projects here. So the general idea is with approver is they're generally considered the main person on, approvers are the main people on these tasks. So this file is got Tom as an approver, and if he approves the file, it moves forward in the workflow. If Tom rejects the file, it fails out of the workflow and waits for correction, because you're saying it's Tom's got the decision. If he thinks the file is good, it's good to go on. If he rejects it, something's bad, and maybe it needs to be revised or re-uploaded or corrected in some way. Generally, if you had multiple approvers, they all need to approve the file. If you have, if either of them rejects, if multiple approvers and one of them rejects, it fails out of the workflow. So they're kind of the basic standard approver. Most people you put in are going to be approvers. Now, there's also a type called a reviewer. And what reviewers can basically do is register their opinion on a page, but they don't have any power to advance or reject the file. So if I pull in this file here again, and we've got both Nora and Tom in here, and this time Nora is a reviewer here. So this file is only going to move forwards if Tom approves it. Nora has the ability to approve the file, and it'll mark a note, but it won't actually go forwards. Reviewers, basically, they can register an opinion, but it doesn't have any weight on whether the file moves forwards or not. Likewise, if I reprocess this file, then let me dramatic pause. If I reject the file as a reviewer, then that file is going to, again, not fail out of the workflow. And if Tom wants to, he can still prove it and push it forwards. They're basically registering opinion. They can say whether they like the file or not. It's clearly indicated here, but it doesn't actually control flow through the workflow. So this is one of those things where I haven't seen a lot of people actually use it this way, but I think the idea was they can register their opinion and it's clearly noted somewhere. So maybe then if they leave an annotation saying what they didn't like, maybe an approver can go in and look and see what the problem was if they're coming in later to do the review. Now, the weird thing is I've seen approvers act slightly differently if there's no, reviewers act slightly differently if there's no approver on the step. And this is an interesting case because I think this was kind of meant as like a backup in here, but I've seen people use this reviewers this way more than I think the intended way. So if you have no approvers on a step, reviewers act differently. So if Tom in here is a reviewer, and if he approves the file, it actually moves forwards as if he were an approver. So if there's no approvers on the step, a reviewer can advance the file. But if a reviewer rejects a file and there's no approvers on the step, then it goes forwards again as if there was no issue. So it moves forward in the workflow, but makes a note. So this is maybe a case where you want someone to review the file, you want them to say whether they like it or not and register their opinion. Their opinion can control, once they register their opinion, the file moves on, but they can't really reject the file out of the workflow in this case. So I think this was intended more as a backup if you forgot to put an approver on, but I've seen a few people do workflows this way where they want to make this note, but have the file move on anyway, even if someone rejects. Now, the third type of user we have in here is what we call a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers are basically like an emergency push through. So maybe we've got a case here, we've got two approvers, we've got Joan and we've got Nora. Now this file, Nora goes ahead and approves, but the file won't actually advance until all the approvers approve. So it won't go forwards until both Joan and Nora approve. But maybe we're out at lunch, maybe Joan's out at lunch, press deadline's coming up, so the design manager or the art director says, okay, I know Joan should look at this, but where we got a press deadline, I want to push this through. The gatekeeper can push files past other users. So they can say, okay, I know that not everyone's approved. I'm okay with that. I want to push the file through. So this might be the boss or something saying push it through anyway. So that can be useful in cases like this. I think there is a little confusion about gatekeepers. I think sometimes there's a misconception that they're a sort of super user, because I've seen a few people either accidentally or on purpose try making approval steps where all the users are gatekeepers, and that tends to cause problems because the workflow will never wait for a gatekeeper to approve. So if you make a step where there's only a gatekeeper and there's no approvers and there's no reviewers, if you run that file through the workflow, then what's going to happen in here is it's just going to go on and it's going to skip the approval and go straight to the end, which in most cases aren't what you want to happen. So just a heads up there that you always need an approver or a reviewer, at least one of those in this step. Gatekeepers aren't a super user, they're mainly just an emergency bypass. Now I'll mention one other gotcha in here, actually one interesting case. In older versions of ES, the only way to do that sort of bypass was to use gatekeepers, but that can sometimes be tedious if you forgot to put a gatekeeper in and you need to push a file through. So in a few versions back, I think a few years back, Dalim put in a second way to handle this sort of case without using gatekeepers. And I'll mention it because I know it's bitten a few customers. So in this case, I've got my file, it's waiting for both Joan and Nora to approve. If I go ahead and approve that file as Nora, it's still waiting for Joan. Maybe Joan's at lunch. Maybe our gatekeeper, Tom's at lunch. What Nora could do here is if you give her permission to use this feature in her user profile, is she could right click on Joan and bypass Joan's approval. Or if you want to be more drastic, actually delete Joan out of the approval step directly from here, which could be handy in a case like this, but we run into some problems with it. Because the strange thing is Dalim makes this by available default to most users. And we've seen cases where end users who shouldn't have accessed that option have bypassed everyone else and forced files past people that who should have been forced to weigh in on it. And the reason that happens, just to alert you to this so you're aware of it, is if you go into the administration area of ES, and I go into a user profile, which we don't have time to really dive into today. These are basically what controls what permissions you have within the application. So what things you can do and what things you can do at C and within ES. They basically control whether you're like an administrator or an end user. But there's a buried setting way in here in the project setup. If you go over here to this tab, by default, when you're making a new user profile, these bypass and delete options, the two things we used here, are enabled by default. So we've seen a few cases where people have went and they've gone ahead and created a new limited user profile for some customer end user, and they didn't realize they were giving the customer end user the ability to bypass approvers. And then the end user would somehow by chance find this option and start bypassing everyone else in this process and send something to press that wasn't ready. So we've seen a few cases where we have problems like that. So definitely when you're setting up permissions for end users, this is a setting to check, especially if you want to make sure end users don't have the ability to do this. So just a friendly heads up there. So now there's one other type of approval in ES aside from the standard approval WFL we're doing here. There's a second type of approval called a milestone approval. And you can use this if you have the enterprise project tracking feature. So the milestones normally, as we were looking at earlier, are just your standard, and I know we're getting low on time. I'm getting closer to the end of the basic thing, and then we'll do questions, and then we can do a few more advanced examples for anyone who wants to hang on. But milestones are generally, like I said, most parts are for deadlines and status. But there are a few special cases where you can use milestones as an approval. So if I go into the administration area, I go to workflows, milestones. If you have enterprise project tracking, you can build your own custom milestones like this that represent whatever custom status in the workflow you want. Now there's a checkbox in there where you can say they must be approved. And if you do that, then these are very simple approvals compared to the approval WFL setup. They're generally role-based approvals. So you can say that I want the CSR to approve this, and whoever's assigned the CSR role in the project can approve that approval milestone. Now these do have a few unique features that standard approval WFL steps don't have, which is why they're interesting. The first is they have a few different types of approvals. They have the standard approval option here, which is what gives you that approve and reject button, where you approve it, it advances, you reject it, it fails. They also have what's called a step approval, which is really, I guess, more like a manual breakpoint in the workflow. This would show rather than approve and reject buttons, it'll show like a play icon. The idea is it's not a case where you're approving or rejecting a file. It's a case where you're pausing the workflow for a manual touch point, and then someone hits that play or resume button to restart the workflow after they've done something. The third option here is there's an upload option where you can have a milestone approval that someone needs to upload a certain file before the workflow will continue on, because maybe you need some dependency before the process can complete correctly. That tends to be a little more useful in project workflows. But we've got our options here. We're going to show a step approval in this case. The second reason that milestone approvals are useful is because you can attach a job ticket layout with metadata to it to force someone to enter metadata when they get to that step. So for example, on these pages I have here, if I do a right-click properties, I put in on this document level a job ticket that someone can click on and use to fill out information like a SKU and what intent or what brand or product name something's associated with, and just collect some information in here. But maybe some end users aren't going to go in and manually click and find that. I could have it set up so that they need to approve this milestone as part of the workflow before it delivers to the printer. But before they can deliver it, they're forced to go in and fill out that SKU and other information because that's important to what happens downstream in the process. So I think we'll show an example of that right now. I know we're coming up on the hour just about now, so the end is near here, and then we'll get to the questions shortly. So what we'll do here is it would help if I could remember what I named my workflow like 5 minutes ago. So we'll go into our workflow here and we'll drag some of these tools over. And I'm just going to delete this, and we'll put our complete missing metadata milestone in here and link that in. Now, what this is going to do is we'll go back to our job and we'll upload a new page. So what names haven't I used already? I'm in the wrong project. So I'll go to this project and push in a simple file here. And like we saw with the approvers, when you change the approvers on this job ticket, files already in didn't adjust their approvers automatically. It's kind of the same thing with workflow, because if we look at this new file we just brought in, you'll see that has our new milestone in it. But if we look at an existing file that was uploaded before we made the change, that doesn't have our milestone, is running through an older version of the workflow. And even if we hit reprocess by default, that will run through an older version of the workflow. And as with the approvers, that sort of makes sense here because maybe you've got a very big complex workflow and you make some very drastic changes to it. Dalim doesn't want to break anything that's in motion. So maybe you made some drastic changes and that would cause major problems if the existing files tried to update and reconcile the changes in those two workflows. So one thing you can do in this case is if you did have a case where you really did want to reprocess one of those files with a newer version of the workflow, what you can do is go to workflow, document workflow, and reprocess from workflow template. And what that'll do is that'll reprocess the file with the newer version of the workflow and update it to use the latest version of the workflow. Now we'll run one of these files through this workflow. Actually, I think I'm gonna bypass our CSR because I'm lazy here. And we'll move past that step and we'll get to our milestone approval. I have to remember who I set up as the approver for that. Too many windows here. So, okay, yes, Tom was the CSR here. So you'll see that actually we're at the milestone approval for complete missing metadata now. So the interesting thing here is if we look at the approvals tab, those milestone approvals don't show up in the approvals tab here. They show in the milestone tab here. And I can click the standard approval thing up here in the corner to approve it. But if I look on the milestone tab, you'll see we have that play icon or that resume icon because this is a step approval. When we set up the milestone, if we set that up as approve or reject, it would show the two approve or reject icons right here instead, or upload it would show an area where you could push in a new file. But I can go ahead and click the play icon to approve that, and it brings up our job ticket. And I set up some restraints here, so if I just mash keys, that doesn't match the format of my SKU, so it'll yell at me and I can't push this file forward until I enter a valid SKU. So that'll go ahead and push that file through the process and then deliver it. So that's how milestone approvals work. And as I promised earlier, I forgot about milestone order. So this is a good example of, that was the complete missing metadata was the final milestone I added to the workflow. So it shows at the bottom. Realistically, that should show before delivered because that comes earlier in the process. So just don't do as I say, not as I do. You can put in here the milestone order. So that one was 3, so I make this 4, and then make this 5 in here. So those all display chronologically. Would probably make a little more sense for end users. So a good example of that gotcha here when I make a mistake during my own webinar. So we've got 2 types of approvals. We've got standard approval WFL, and we've got the milestone approvals. Which should you use? So I would say in general, I would use approval WFL if you have a case where multiple, that's generally the standard, is usually the safe way to go. You have to use it if you want multiple people to approve. If you want to do anything complex with the gatekeepers and reviewers, that's generally the standard option, the safe option. Milestone approvals tend to be more useful for niche cases like this, where you want to do a step approval or an upload approval, or you want to attach a job ticket to a specific approval step like we did here. So that's how those work out. Now, as far as the agenda, what's next, I think what I'll do real quick is I'll show a few notes on some other interesting tools. We'll do a very quick troubleshooting thing. We'll take questions, and then if anyone wants to hang on a little further, I'll show a few more of the advanced examples. So we didn't have time to get to all the tools today. So just to give you an idea of the sort of things ES is capable of here, a few just interesting tools off the top of my head. So we've got first off a document step, which is a tool that allows you to delete, copy, or rename files. We've got a tool called folder step that allows you to take a file and move it into another subfolder. There's a tool called sharing that allows you to generate a sharing link so that non-ES users can view it as sort of a guest. So your workflow could generate that link and email it out to certain people in cases. There are eTwist and ES Connect steps that allow you to send Twist files to Twist for low-level normalization or pre-flight. There are two tools called Send Event and Wait Event that allow you to synchronize workflows that are running on multiple files. So maybe you've got a case where you've got 50 files in a project and you're going through an approval. You don't want a single file in that project to deliver until all the files in that project have been delivered, approved, and then you want to deliver them all as a batch. You can use send and wait events to coordinate between multiple workflows for some kind of synchronized multi-file action. And lastly, we've got script steps that allow you to write your own custom tool if EOS doesn't have one that does what you need. So maybe you've got an MIS system or something that you want to interact with via that system's API, either to trigger some event or to pull some information from that system into ES. ES obviously wouldn't have a default tool for your other systems, so you could write a custom Bash or Python script that connects to your system and pulls some metadata or performs some action, and then brings information back into ES. So these can be very powerful tools here. So before we wrap up the basics of the work of this webinar, I'm just going to do a quick few notes on troubleshooting. So first off, on troubleshooting, what do you do if something goes wrong? Maybe the best way to start on this is to actually make something go wrong. So I'm going to go ahead and break my workflow. So first off, I'm going to choose a no good, very bad output channel here that's going to fail during trying to send the file. Secondly, I'm just going to do something silly like invert this link so it doesn't make logical sense. And I'll go ahead and save that workflow. Now if we go back to our project and maybe we try reprocessing one of these pages from the workflow template, maybe we'll choose this poor victim here. And what this project is going to do is I think it's going to go through our standard approval. And actually yell at me for metadata, so I got to get our CSR to come in and fix it. So I'll go ahead and add some metadata. And now when this tries to transmit, it's actually going to fail out of the workflow and reject, and you can see I've got a red error here. So a few of the things we can do to troubleshoot this. One of the most helpful screens is if you do your workflow document workflow, show workflow. And if we look at our diagram here, we can see there's an obvious error. It's very red. It's very clear that something went wrong here. There's a few different places we can look to try and get more information about what went wrong. So one of the first is if we select this file, we can go to WFL log. Actually, we don't need to select for this one. We can just go straight to workflow log up here in the menu. And this will show us some basic details. It actually doesn't give us anything for this particular step, but some steps will record some interesting log info here on what they're doing. So that's always worth checking. One very useful one, try not to scream when I bring this up because it's a little messy, but if you go to workflow log JDF output, if you select the step, this will show you all the low-level information that the delivery step sent back to the engine when it had the issue. But usually you don't have to worry about most of this. Generally, if there's an error right at the very bottom of this output, this will have sometimes a clear error to tell you exactly what went wrong in here. In this case, it says no such file or directory. It couldn't write, this output channel couldn't write to the directory because it didn't exist and it didn't have permission to create it. Looking around here, sometimes you can kind of guess about what might have been the problem. If I look around just the other information here, I can see some trying to, in this case, deliver to an obviously fake path here. So I can get a little more information. Generally, if you don't know what these mean, you can always open a support ticket and send it to us, and we can lend a little more context on what that error message might mean or what might be going wrong there. But that can give you a good first place to start looking. If you're command line savvy, another thing you can do is actually go over to your command line and look at the Tomcat log files. So for this particular case, for Tomcat 9, the path's different if you're using an older version of ES, but I can use this tail F command to tail this log file here, symlinks common Tomcat 9.0 logs Catalina out. The tail command here means we want Linux to follow this file. I'm hitting enter so I can clear the screen, but any new lines that appear in that file will show up on my screen here. So sometimes you can try reproducing whatever the error was, and that will spit out some more error messages in your log. So we can see here maybe a little more context here as it says, obviously fake path, no such file or directory, and I got our error here in a little more detail than I got on JDF out. So sometimes that'll give you some good information there. One last resource in the screen just for the basics is if I click on any of these steps, it doesn't really matter which one, and I go to WFL log, show context. This doesn't make quite sense for this particular error, but maybe you've got a case where something's trying to deliver to a very weird path and you're using variables in your output channel. This show context will show you the state of all metadata file has associated with it, any information that's associated with it, and what the variables are actually set to. So maybe if a variable is giving you some unexpected output, you can say, okay, that's where that weird number in my delivery path that's failing is coming from. so that can give you a little more context on where things might be going wrong there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in cases like this is a pretty egregious error. So in this case, I would probably just go into the actual overall workflow in the administration area and correct the workflow for everything and reprocess from template. But maybe you've got a case where there's some logic error that only affects certain files and you want to spot correct a particular file. Or you're building a new workflow and you're trying to test some things before you actually commit the changes to the full workflow. You can actually edit the workflow for one particular file. So this file here I'm looking at in my show workflow. If I do workflow editing mode, I can go ahead and bring up basically the workflow for just this file and correct it. So I can go ahead here and I can change, for example, this to go to our correct output channel, and I can do an invert here so that that link goes the correct order, and I can hit save. If I use then workflow, show workflow to bring it back to the real workflow view, and if I rerun this file, it should complete correctly. I guess I have to fill out my metadata because that step's going to happen every single time here. So I'll go ahead and approve that, and our file runs good. But the nice thing about that is you can make a change for one particular file. If I look at the actual workflow in here, then you can see that that's still got some of the bad code in it. So you can test a change without deploying it to everything on the system, which is very handy. So I think as far as the basics, this is all the core basic stuff I wanted to show today. If people want to hang on, we can do a few more advanced examples. But before we get to those, I wanted to check, does anyone have any questions up to this point?
Yeah, there was a couple more. All right. Are all the features you've been showing here available in the React interface?
Well, generally the React interface is sort of just an end user view. So the React interface is generally you would have an end user login with React and just gives them a different UI view of ES. The React UI is generally focused on end users, so it doesn't let you modify workflows or anything. It can, of course, use the workflows. When you upload a file through React, it would be using the workflows that you configured in kind of the full admin area. So I don't know if that answers the question well or not, but
I think so.
Yeah.
Then what happens if approvers who are part of a group have conflicting responses?
Well, generally with a group, the way this is set up right now, for the examples we were doing in here, we had this set to, for like this, we have the QA group in here. By default, when you add a group as an approver, the number of approvals is set to 1. So as long as one person in that group approves, it'll move on. So that wouldn't give you an option for multiple conflicting approvals in here at this particular point, because as soon as the first person approved or rejected, it would move forward or fail out of the workflow. The case you're describing could come up, I think, if you had number of approvers in that group set to 3, where you needed 3 people from the group to approve before things would move on. It's been a long time since I played with this. Off the top of my head, my best guess is if you had a case where you needed 3 people in the QA group to approve, and the first approved and the second rejected, my thought would be as soon as someone rejects it, it would probably fail out of the workflow, would be my expectation. Because with any of these approval steps in general, it'll keep waiting until you get all the approvals you need, but one rejection from an approver is enough to kill the file dead. So
I think that's right, but I'd have to test again.
It's been a while since I played with that, but.
Right, if that answers your, hold on, yes it does. Okay, thanks. All right, that's it. That was the questions.
Okay, so that concludes kind of the core part of the webinar. I know we've gone well over the hour. If anyone is interested in sticking on, I'm going to try and show really quickly, maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, of 2 more examples of some more complex workflows. We don't really have time to get in depth on them, but just to show you some more examples of what kind of things come next and just different things that might be useful as you build out these workflows. So the first is we ran into, you actually saw I tripped myself up here on that last example I did, where we had the complete missing metadata step here. I reprocessed this file and it stopped at that step even though we already had a SKU in here. Because maybe we've got a case where it's nice if no one's filled out that SKU, we want to stop at that missing metadata step and force the user to enter it. But if someone was already proactive and went in and did a right-click properties and put that information in, or maybe we pulled that out of existing metadata in the file, we don't want to waste and manually do a touch point when it's not needed. So wouldn't it be nice if the workflow could selectively do different things depending on conditions like metadata? So if we go back to our workflow, first I'm going to fix all the things I broke because otherwise I will forget and this will bomb horribly in like 30 seconds. So we'll fix and go back to our good output channel and save that. And what I'm going to do here is I will try and explain this. I'm going to build it first and I'll try and explain it second. So I'm going to bring in two tools here. The first is I'm going to bring in what we call an OR tool. And secondly, I'm going to bring in what we call a node. And what I'm going to do is off of this approve step, I'm going to link this node in here. And I'm going to link, okay, all these tools like this. And I think I got that right. So what would be nice in this case is maybe we've got a scenario where, okay, we don't have a SKU. I want to go down this branch and force the user to enter one. Or we already have a SKU, it's great, we can skip that and just move on in the process. So that's done with these tools we have here. But the next thing we need to do is set up what we call a link condition. So we've got two branches and we want the workflow to follow them in different conditions. If I click on either of these links, there's an option in the right-hand context pane where I can choose a link condition. So in this particular case, there's different options. You can say, I want to go down this link if there's an error. If you want to get really nitty-gritty, you can write your own custom JavaScript to do all sorts of calculations. Or you can click in newer versions of ES, this condition editor button. And what this does is allows us to look at things like metadata and build rules from we'll follow the path. So in this case, I'm going to say when the file is missing SKU metadata, follow this path. I can also make these more complex. So if I want to have multiple conditions, I could add in, for example, a second one. So I want to say I only care about this metadata if it's a print project. So I could say if the project has what we would call maybe it's a print intent. And you can control how many of these rules are needed to match in order to push the file forwards. So in this case, I have this set to end, which means both of these conditions need to match. So the SKU needs to be missing and it needs to be a print project. If it's a web project, it would go through even if the SKU is missing because we don't care in that case. You can also do an OR condition here, where in this case, if either the SKU is missing or it's a print project, go down this link. In this case, I think we'll just make it a little simpler for demo purposes and only look for the missing SKU. Now, the second part of this is we need to add another link here that says if no other link matches, because we don't want it to always go down this other branch too. So we'll make that if no other link matches. So if there's no SKU, it goes down this branch, it forces the user to enter it. If there is a SKU, it follows this branch by default and goes down here and skips that manual collection. So I guess if we try that now, I'm going to clear out all my pages so I don't forget which ones I already set this on. We'll upload maybe 2 new pages to our project here. So let me push in 2 example pages here. So these 2 pages are going to come in, and I'm going to, for one of these, I'm going to go in while the other one's cooking, and I'm going to go ahead and add in a SKU. For the second one, I'm going to be bad and not add a SKU. So yep, we can see we got a SKU in here. So if I go ahead and approve these 2 pages, we should see is, oh, do I have a CSR in here? I forgot to. Again, I'm going to be lazy because I made this too complex for myself and bypass my CSR. That's why you shouldn't give people access to this option because they will bypass everyone in the approval like I'm doing right now. So you can see here on our files, if we look at this one, this had the SKU configured, so it canceled the collection and it went down this branch instead and delivered. This second file here didn't have the SKU configured, so it's currently held waiting for our CSR to go ahead and go in and enter the SKU and would force them to do so. So to explain a few of the tools in here, what we were looking and what we were doing here, the first important tool here is the OR. Generally, when you're splitting branches like this apart and forking branches, generally by the time the workflow ends, you want to merge those branches back together. If you don't, ES can get very confused about workflow status. So what you would want to do here is the OR tool tells it when it should continue on and when these branches should be considered complete. In this particular case, we have an OR tool, which means if either of these two branches reaches this OR, then the workflow will continue on. Because in this case, it makes sense, the workflow, because these two conditions are opposites. So it'll only ever go down one of these branches. We don't care which one it follows. As long as it completes one of them, then the workflow will move on and send the files to the printer. There is a more advanced there's another option too called end for different circumstances. Like I built a complex workflow here where I forked off and I have two separate simultaneous approvals, regulatory approval and marketing approval. And the workflow won't continue on. There's an end tool in here. So the workflow after those two approvals will merge back together at that end. And the workflow won't continue on to its next step until both the regulatory and marketing approvals have been completed. In this particular case, it doesn't matter what order they're completed, which is why we split them apart. So regulatory can approve first or marketing can approve first. It doesn't care as long as they're both approved. In this case, we want the workflow to move on as long as one of those steps is completed. Now there's a second touch point in here, which is that node. And the reason we have that node, and there's a bit of a quirk of ES's workflow system, when you follow one branch and this branch matched, this other branch it cancels the tool immediately after that other branch that it didn't follow, which in this case would be kind of problematic because our OR tool would have been next if we didn't put in this node. And if you had that happen and then the OR got canceled, then we would wind up, the workflow would wind up stalling abruptly. So we tend to put in what we call a buffer node. A node is just a blank tool that doesn't do anything. It fills up space on your workflow. Sometimes that can be useful in cases like this where we need something to take the cancellation hit from that bad link. It can also be useful in cases where maybe you're revising a workflow a lot and relinking things a lot. Maybe you don't want to have multiple tools come off of that approved. You could stick a node in there and link all the tools up to that so that if that approved step gets removed, you don't have to constantly relink. You can just have that node be kind of a touch point in the workflow. But that's generally how that ends up working there. One other use for these conditional links is if you go in and do for example, here we have our approval. If someone rejects this approval, then I could go ahead and go in and put a milestone here called waiting for correction, because it doesn't give you much information if someone rejects the file. So one thing I could do is put a link here off of this approval and set this with a special condition that says on error. Generally, this will say this will follow this link if there's an error. On error links are a rare condition where you don't need to do the if no when the link matches, because the workflow ends immediately if you run into an error. But in this case, it'll follow, if someone rejects the file, it'll follow the on error link and show a waiting for correction status in that milestone sidebar, which can be helpful because it can let someone know, an end user, where that file is at in the process, especially if they have multiple approval steps in their workflow. But so one more example very quickly, and then we'll end this. So one other kind of flaw with this workflow we have set up in our project right now is this file is delivered, for example. This has been sent to press, but what happens if someone comes in and a user could start like sticking annotations on the page and saying things, even though the file is already gone to press, or even worse, maybe uploading a new revision of that file and starting to go through approval cycle, although the file has already gone to print, and winding up with confusion and unhappiness and bad times had by all. So wouldn't it be nice if after the file is done, we lock it and prevent people from revising it or making notes on it or things like that? This is one I'm gonna have to go very quick on because I can't explain all the specifics in the time we have today. But there's two things you can do to handle both those cases. The first is in the input rule for this file. We go into IO and we go into our input rule. Every time a file is uploaded into ES, it's run through some evaluation rule that does things like set workflow maybe, or map it to a project if it's uploaded through a hot folder. But in this particular case, what we want to do in here is go in and where it says allows input file, we can set this to say allows input file if before step delivered. And what that means is if the workflow passes this step, this input channel won't let files go into ES and revision after that point. So if I go ahead and save that and I go back to my project and I try and upload a new file, what we'll see now is we'll get a little red circle in here. Oh, guess I did my example wrong here. Maybe that came in through a different input role, or maybe I have a bug. So that should be good. So I'll do, try that one more time. And yep, okay, there we go. Maybe I just did it too quick and the rule didn't finish saving. So you can see here, it didn't revision that time and we got a little red 1. And that tells us that there's one revision someone attempted to make that didn't, that was refused because the file is too far in the process to allow revisions. So that means that basically someone tried to revise it. It's not letting them revise it. It's not bringing the file in and running the workflow on it. So that's one way you can prevent people from uploading new files after the file has gone to press. Now, if you're an admin and you give the user permission to do so, they can click on that little red circle and force assign a page if it's an emergency. But at least in this case, it lets the user know their file didn't upload. And if it's a real special case where something needs to happen, they need to get in touch with a human. So a good way you can prevent them from sneaking things in at the last minute. Now, the second part of this is we want to prevent people maybe from annotating on these files after they reach a certain point. One thing we can do is, this is another feature we can't really deep dive into for time constraints today, but if we go into our workflow, just to show you a very simple example, I have a milestone in here called lock document. And this is a default milestone that ships with ES, so you can use this even if you don't have the enterprise project tracking feature. So if we go back and we reprocess our file, for example, through the workflow template, and we approve it through all the steps, then what's going to happen this time is when this gets to the end of the process, it's going to basically lock the file so I can't make annotations or anything like that. So for example, if I go in here and try and annotate, I can't make notes on this page. So I can lock down what users can do once the file has gone to press, so someone can't try and sneak in a last minute correction too late. But that uses a feature called a profile mask, which under the hood, too complex to get into with our time constraints today, but the profile mask basically lets you take away certain features from users when files are in a certain point in the workflow, so that when a file is going through a certain part of the workflow, users maybe can't delete it or download it or annotate it or things like that. So it can be a useful thing there. So that's everything I had for today. I don't know if we got any late questions about the late examples we had here, but that's everything I got for today. So
You just got a couple of thanks and that's it, Alex.
Glad to hear it. So sorry, I know we went a little bit long. Thanks for staying on, but hopefully that was useful to you.
Well, you retained 25 out of 32, so not bad.
Yep, well, I figured those last 2 demos were sort of bonus things. So those were just extra. I got most of it done within the main hour of the webinar. So
Thanks, appreciate it.
take care. Have a good one, everyone.